Welcome back to the table, everyone. Today we have a beast of a game out here. This is Nightmare Cathedral, the newest one from Board and Dice. We've had a chance to play this a few times now, and one of the things that's going to captivate people right away is the artwork of this game and the theme. This is a game that was inspired and uses the art of Zdzisław Beksiński, a Polish artist who is kind of near and dear to our heart.
Yeah, that's true. Well, for one thing, I mean, a lot of people really love his artwork.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen what he's done, he has a lot of like horror, I would say nightmare-themed artwork. A lot of it's very surreal, and it's actually been used as the inspiration for a lot of things. And actually, something that we love right now, Elden Ring, which is a very popular video game, the creator of that game cited this as one of his sources of just like how the world looks and everything. And you can just see that from looking at this board, looking at these miniatures. And what's really neat is the care that I think they've put into replicating his paintings into these figures. Basically everything, all of these minis, the nightmares, even the cover of the box, comes from paintings that he did.
Yeah, and it doesn't just end there. The game itself is kind of I don't want to say just area control, because this is an area control game unlike a lot of them that I've played before, because a lot of the point scoring that you're going to be doing is based on other things than typically just controlling or dominating as many spaces. You've got very specific things that you want to do out there, almost like objectives, to sort of check those off and score lots of points, as well as some other more Euro-y feeling things that you wouldn't expect in a game like that.
Yeah, now it is, like David said, an area control game, so it is going to change a little bit based on player count. There's actually two sides of the board, so if you're playing with a two-player game, you're playing on one side, and on this side, you actually have tiles that land on the board to kind of shrink down your area. So we have this set up for a 3-player game right now, and this board is kind of set up as it would start. Every player is going to start with a special fort, which is a fortress, which kind of signifies their starting location, and a shaper, which is kind of like, you can think of like the commander, the general of your army, whatever. The shaper flies around doing a lot of different things other than fighting. Meanwhile, you have your followers, which were the tiny minis, which are actually going to be going out to these spaces and battling either other players or these gray shadows, which will be populating on the board as well.
Yeah, the followers are really where a lot of the meat and potatoes of things that are happening out on the board are going on. We're also going to have, we don't have them shown here, dreamers, which are going to be up here at the top of the board. That section of the board is actually what you're using on your turn to take your actions. You've got some action cards. Everyone's going to have 5 beginning action cards at the start of the game, one of which will be upgraded during setup. But those actions correspond to these 5 spaces on the board, and you're going to be moving your dreamers in these 3 spaces and kind of cycling through those spaces as best you can to try to get a little bit of an engine going with what you're doing.
Yeah, I'd say that the action selection system in this game is very unique in that not only do you have your action cards that can be upgraded, but based on where you're moving on this, because each one of these spots, the light gray spots, they're called day actions, and these are the things that you're doing primarily on your turn. But every one of them has an arrow, and it's going to move you into one of these 3 night zones. The next day, you can't take any day action that you're adjacent to. So you're having to kind of bounce around. You have to pay attention to where that arrow is sending you so you know what actions you're restricting yourself for. But on top of that, there's another mechanic where you can follow other players' actions. If you're adjacent to the action they're taking, you get a better version than if you're not, which is kind of interesting. There's this like conform and descent system happening here.
Yeah, so when you take your action, you're going to be moving your dreamer into a day space and taking that action depending on what card you have in front of you. Like I said, everyone's going to start with the same 5 cards, except one's going to be upgraded. There is a method, in fact, one of the actions allows you to play more cards. You can play some of those to upgrade some of these actions. And when I say upgrade, I mean upgrade. These things can change drastically and differently. So for instance, there's a summon, maneuver, fortify, develop, and perform ritual action. My fortify could be significantly different or more powerful if I've upgraded it than Ryan's. And then if Ryan upgrades his, it could be more powerful, but slightly different even still than my upgrade.
Yeah, it would be, because there's no 2 of the same upgrades. So if you're upgrading the same action, you're doing it in a very different way. And what's unique about some of these actions that you can take, or some of these upgrades you could take, is it might change the actual meat of the action, or it might change that conform or descent action, making it actually stronger if you're not the one taking actions, but following other people. So there's now this whole element of like timing when you're taking your actions, because you're looking at where other players might be, because you don't want them to be able to trigger their best actions necessarily.
Yeah, and back to that conform and dissent, like Ryan started to say, when a player takes their action and takes it, all the other players, after effectively they're done, are going to choose to either conform or dissent if they're adjacent to where they took that action on the night space versus the day spaces. But if they're not adjacent, they have to dissent. So, and both are generally pretty good, but generally speaking, conform is probably a little bit more associated with the action anyway.
Yeah, it's situationally better.
Yeah.
Like on that fortify, it lets you play an upgrade, but if you don't have an upgrade from your hand, maybe it's not the best option to take. Maybe you want to dissent in that case, right?
Yeah, so let's take a really quick overview of what these actions are. Summon is what you're going to be doing to get more of your followers out on the board. You're going to want forts out there, and when you summon, you're generally going to get some number of followers at each of those forts. But like I said a second ago, the upgrades can change that significantly. In my last game, I had an upgrade that made it so I summoned one follower everywhere I controlled, whether there was a fort there or not, which could be great if you're spread around the board, but if you just have a couple forts and you're not spread around the board, not so great. Maneuver lets you move. You're going to get some movement points and move around the board, but it does a few more things than that. You're going to move, then you're going to use your shaper, and the shaper is also something that you can move with those points, to effectively convert one of the opposing forces or followers or one of these shadows in whatever space it's in. So if my shadow or my shaper stopped here, I could convert this shadow into one of my followers, thereby making it a region that I control.
Yeah, and maneuver also is how you're going to be starting fights with other players or with these shadows. If you move your units into an area, it doesn't necessarily start a fight. You can actually have units in areas with other players. But some actions like maneuver will let you cause conflicts.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting part too, because you're looking around the board, you're starting conflicts anywhere that there could be a conflict. You don't have to be involved in that conflict. So if you're in a situation where your opponent is in a space with some shadows and they're outnumbered, you can actually trigger that conflict and make the shadows fight them, even though there's a good chance they'll lose.
Yeah, it's really quite interesting, because even if in a 4-player game, everyone could be in one area, and I could simply choose to cause a conflict there between other people other than me and watch them whittle themselves down, because the basic maneuver lets you resolve 3 conflicts. So you can keep doing that. And it's interesting because the conflicts are going to be resolved in a number of ways. If it's between 2 players, effectively, whoever is left with dominance of the area, which means you either have a fort or more followers than the other player, is going to remain there, and then the other people have to go out. Of course, you are going to potentially, during a conflict, eliminate followers, which are going to go down to limbo, which can be spent for other things, which is kind of a nice mechanism.
Yeah, and combat itself is very deterministic. You're going to be able to play cards, and no units have any kind of inherent strength. However, the more units you have in a fight, the more cards you can play. But those cards are lost. So if you're playing a card for its combat value, that means you're not getting it as an upgrade. You're not getting it as a ploy card that you could potentially play later. You're literally using it for that combat. With one exception, everyone does have one starter combat card that they can always play. And really, you're just comparing your hits. If you played a card with 2 hits in a defense, your opponent played 1 card with a hit, you could do the math there, block that hit, and then you still do 2 back. Now, the enemies are actually being controlled by kind of an AI. They have their own attack deck, and fighting those shadows is actually better, I would say, than fighting other opponents, because you can actually earn rewards for fighting the shadow.
Yeah, when you fight an opponent, you're usually just making it more difficult for the other players at the table. When you're fighting the shadows, you're going to get either a reward for victory or probably a bit of a penalty for defeat. So like Ryan said, if I'm able to force him into fighting a shadow and maybe face that defeat situation, it's going to be particularly bad for him. But this is how you can get some rewards, and it also adds a little bit of tension when you flip that conflict card over to find out what the shadows are going to do. And they effectively have different combinations of attack and defense when you flip them over, depending on how many units are in there. And it should be stated, there can only be 3 of any given unit in any area. So I can't have more than 3 here, there can't be more than 3 shadows here, and so on for all the players. Now, there are some things that can improve that, and that's part of the Fortify card. The Fortify action is going to allow you to put forts out there. So in any region or area that you control, you're going to be able to trade in followers from anywhere on the board in order to place forts there. And now you might place 1 level of fort, you might get rid of more followers to place 2. When you're placing forts out there, they can be from levels 1 all the way to 3, and this just basically makes it more difficult for other players to take dominance away from you in that area. Plus, there are going to be some points at the end of the game. The last thing on the Fortify card, other than the Conform and Dissent actions, is your unit limit. Like I said, it's usually 3, but some of the upgrades are going to let you have maybe 4 in one of your spaces. It's not as simple as having 4 everywhere, but you can have 3 everywhere and then maybe one area that has 4, or maybe more. We haven't seen all the cards.
No, we haven't. There's a lot of cards to go through. And that actually brings us to the next action, which is Develop, which is actually how you're going to be playing these cards. You're going to have a hand of these cards. It's not automatically generated, so you're going to have to find ways to draw cards by sometimes dissenting will let you draw cards, some actions will let you draw cards. But this is how you're going to play them. And you can play 2 cards with the basic version of Develop. And these can either be an upgrade, which is going to be placed down. We've talked about that a little bit, and increase the power of one of your actions. Or you can play what's called a ploy card. And this is where the game gets a little hard to predict, because these are going to break the rules of the game. They're going to let you do things that you can't legally do, like just move your pieces across the border, add forts in places where you can't normally add forts. A lot of those things, a lot of the triggers from these ploy cards, and not to mention some of the triggers for summoning and performing a ritual, which we'll talk about, are tied into the symbols that are printed alongside the track up here. And based on whose turn it is or what turn in the round it is, these symbols can refer back to those specific cards. So you might have a card that says, move your shaper to the active symbol, and you could take your shaper and move them to one symbol that matches. So those cards, their effectiveness might change actually based on where you are in the round. So again, we're coming back to that timing element of when to take that develop action and when those cards are the most valuable.
Yeah, and before we get to the last card, we have glossed over a little bit the Conform and Dissent. And like Ryan just said, the timing is significant because you do want to take into consideration what you think other players are going to do and plan what you're going to be doing on their turns, because you can get quite a bit done. And in fact, for instance, on the Summon card, you're going to summon when you use that card, but then every marked area, like the thing we just mentioned, whatever round it is, you're going to look at those areas. Those areas are also going to allow people to produce followers there, whoever has dominance. And it may not be the active player, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and if you conform there, your forts produce 2.
Right.
But again, you can't produce 2 if you already have 3 there, right? So that you just have to kind of see what other players are doing. If you think somebody's going to summon, maybe you want to maneuver, get your guys out of the fort so that you can conform on summon. There's just this whole cycle of these actions all kind of working together.
Yeah, and the last card is called Perform Ritual. Now, this is probably the most Euro-y feeling thing of the game. There is this track, like you might find in a lot of Euros, across the bottom of the board. It's going to be something you abstractly climb up throughout the game in order to trigger various bonuses and potentially score some pretty significant points. Also, each player is going to have 2 pieces on this track, which I think is kind of cool because you can move up 1 very far, but you're only going to get the benefits once. But then you can have this one back here and come back later in the game and trigger some of those same bonuses when some of those bonuses may be a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, so those are the actions that you're taking in the game, and each player is doing all of the things they would do, the actual action, conforming or dissenting, and you're going to be going around a circle doing that for 3 rounds. But what you're actually trying to do, all of this is in service of these dream cards.
Yeah.
And this is a deck of these that are going to be splayed out. Players are going to have dream cards in their hand that they can complete. And these are kind of objectives, not in-game objectives, but they're objectives that you can literally turn in anytime and say, I have achieved this, I'm turning in this dream card. You're going to keep these in a pile, and yes, they are victory points for you, and that's good to have, but these are also what's going to drive the game forward. Because most every time that you complete one of these dream cards, you're helping to build the Nightmare Cathedral in the center of the board, which is kind of the namesake of the game.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've done this entire video thus far, and we haven't even mentioned the Cathedral, but that is sort of the core of the game. You complete these dream cards, and like Ryan said, when you do, and at the bottom there's an icon to add to the Cathedral, you add the next piece. You're going to build the bottom layer, then the second layer, and then sort of the 2 steeples, if you will, on top of that. This is going to also trigger some bonuses along that cathedral track. But most importantly, once the cathedral is built, the game is going to change fairly significant. There's going to be basically a lot of people referring to the first part as the first phase, and then this is the second phase. I do want to remind you, though, this doesn't mean 2 equal halves of the game, because once you've got the Nightmare Cathedral built, you're generally going to be a lot closer to the end of the game than you are the beginning of the game.
Yeah, it's kind of based on player-controlled speed as well, because there are only 3 rounds here, with like the 4th round being scoring, basically the end of the game. You can potentially get all the way to the 3rd round without ever flipping this board if people aren't completing dreams and they're not contributing to the cathedral. But eventually you will be building the cathedral. This does 2 things, like David said. First of all, there's a spot where you're going to finish the cathedral and you're going to upgrade all of the decks with stronger versions of the decks. So you're going to be getting access to level 2 cards and level 2 dreams. So your actions are going to get more powerful and the dreams will get harder as you move through the game. But also, this board is going to flip over to kind of a creepy side, would you say?
A creepier
like
side,
it's a giant open mouth.
It is a giant mouth which is going to end up devouring a lot of followers and shadows in the game, because 2 nightmares that you're going to pick at the beginning of the game are now going to be in play. There's a number of nightmare cards in the game, and at the beginning of the game, you're effectively going to randomly choose any 2 of those. And there's actually quite a bit of variability here, because each nightmare has 2 sides to their card, so you can bring those into play. These, when you command them, and the command function is going to come in on a lot of those cards that Ryan was just mentioning, not to mention, as you go up this ritual track, there's a few spots in order to command a nightmare if you'd like. These are very powerful, and you're going to basically move them a few different areas, and then they're all going to behave and act a little bit differently, but all towards the end goal of devouring followers. Now, when you devour followers, they're going to be removed from the board and removed from the game, so you're not going to be able to use those followers to do anything else, but they're going to go up into that mouth, and that has some end-of-game scoring associated with it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because your goal shifts, because in the first half of the game, while you're building the cathedral, a lot of those dream cards want you to just have a lot of guys out on the board, populate the board with a lot of followers, with a lot of forts. Second half of the game, a lot of the dreams want you to have your people being devoured. So having them devoured is going to complete the dreams. Also, there's in-game scoring. You're going to have points for being the person with the most devoured units. So while it might feel kind of weird, you're taking your own units off the board, you kind of actually want other players to come and devour your units. It's a strange kind of balance there.
It is a strange kind of balance, because a lot of the nightmares on their cards themselves will give you some benefits for devouring shadows or perhaps other units. I haven't looked at all of the nightmare cards.
Nightmares.
So you'll get some immediate benefits there. But remember, if you devour your people at the end of the game, if you have the most there, you're going to get the most points. That's one other significant place to get points, because I do want to point out, scores in this game are not going to be astronomical scores. I've played this now 3 times, and the highest scores are in the maybe mid-20s.
Yeah, maybe you could get up to the 30s.
You probably could. We're not I'm not the greatest gamer in the world, but a lot of the scores I've seen have been in those low to mid, maybe upper 20s, and a lot of those can come from that because, for instance, first place gets 8, and 8 points in a 20-something game.
That's a lot.
Is a lot of the points. But like Ryan said, the dream cards are where a lot of them are going to come from. And then there's only one other source, and that's the ritual track. In addition to the bonuses you get, if you get your pieces past certain points, you're going to get 1 point for each piece that's past it, or maybe 3, 5, 7, all the way to the end. You could potentially get 26 points if you got both tokens at the end. I can tell you right now, I'm not sure how possible that is in the game, but if you really focused on this, it'd be somewhat interesting to see if you could do it, because when you are taking that ritual action, we didn't mention this, you're effectively taking a lot of the followers that you've put out on the board and taking them back off, which also feels somewhat counterintuitive to a game like this. However, if you feel like, you know what, I'm not getting any dream cards accomplished right now based on the followers I've out there, so I'm just going to get my followers back, but as you do, you take them off of certain spaces with these symbols in order to move up corresponding symbols on this track.
So yeah, you've got the forts, like David said earlier, the units that are devoured, the ritual track, the dreams, and potentially some of these card upgrades might have a point or 2 on them. Not significant points, but they might have a few. You're going to combine that all together, and you're going to determine the winner at the end of the 3rd round, or the game can end if you've devoured a certain number of units. And that's going to be based on player count as well. So there almost is that race against time. If you're taking too long to devour, the game will still end, but it can end even a round shorter if you devour enough units.
For sure, and the different nightmares have different devour limits, if you will, based on player count. So in my games, that has happened much faster than getting close to the end. And ironically, we haven't played this at the full 4-player count, to be honest.
true.
We played it at 3 players a couple times. I've played it at 2 players. And my hunch is that the more players you have, in a weird twist, I think it's going to be as fast, if not faster. Because
Definitely,
you're
yeah.
really going, you have that many more people going through those dream cards towards building the Nightmare at Cathedral. Now, with that said, there are some variant rules that weren't in our rule book, but that I've heard of, where you can actually just agree that one piece of the cathedral is going to come out with every player's turn after the first round, so that it just gets to that point where the board flips and the nightmares come out.
Yeah, I think if people are struggling with the dream cards, you could definitely do that to speed up the game.
Yeah.
I haven't had any problem with that because I'm just like, could get those dream cards as fast as possible.
Yeah,
that's my strategy.
The dream cards is a really interesting twist. So this is, like we said, an area control game, but it has very different feel to how you're getting your points. And I think those dream cards and the objectives you're getting there, along with going up sort of this abstract track, are kind of some of the more unique aspects to it. That is Nightmare Cathedral from Board and Dice. If you have any questions at all, please make them in the comments below. Their campaign is live right now, so make sure and go check that out. And as always, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you next time. Congratulations, you got to the end of one of our videos. Now, if you want more practice, just click on the video over here. It's another video. You might not have seen it yet, so click on it. If you don't want to do that, at least click on the subscription button below. That always helps us. And if you want notifications, please ring that bell.